to talk today about the fact that Flesh and Blood is no longer a speculative startup card game. I still have this conversation with someone in the comments section maybe 1, 2, 3 times a month. People who think that Flesh and Blood could just roll over and die at any moment now because there are so few players that they all just might quit at the same time. So there's something called Metcalfes Law, which talks about the relationship between the number of people in a network, the number of nodes, and the value of that network. Imagine that you were the first person ever with a Facebook account. That account had no value to you because there was no one else for you to interact with. But when the second person joined Facebook, you now had one connection between you and that second person. And you can imagine when a third person joins Facebook, there are now 3 possible connections. And on and on and on. And every additional person on the network adds more value to the network than the previous one did. The marginal value of every new person in the network is greater than the previous. And the total value, if you just go by number of connections, would be, I think it's n times n minus 1 over 2. And so you can see that this is exponential with the number of users. Card games kind of act the same way. Now, there are some kind of caveats to that. Typically, when we talk about card games, what you're really interested in is how many people can I play with? How many people can I trade cards with? You know, you can actually trade these things instead of just hoarding them all for yourself. How many card stores can I go to buy from? How many of those are physically located around me? Things like that. So evaluating the value of the network is a little harder because in the Facebook example, from your chair anywhere in the world, you can interact with every other person on the network, kind of. But when you're talking about card games, it's a lot more segmented. Mostly you will only play with people at your kitchen table or people at your local card store or people in your city, let's say, if you're going to a local tournament. So another issue is that to a great degree on Facebook, if you speak English and another user speaks Mandarin, that Mandarin-speaking user does not enhance your experience by being on the network. Now, there's a bit of an exception to that with card games, because if both players are well-versed in the game, they may not really need to know each other's languages to play together. But that's really a low-value edge case. So we've kind of explained how as a network gets bigger and a network of card game players gets bigger, it becomes more valuable. The other part of that, beyond becoming more valuable, is it becomes harder to displace. And so you can imagine Magic. Magic is typically considered to be the most popular game in English-speaking countries. And it has the most number of players, the most number of collectors. I think you would be hard-pressed to find a card store in the English-speaking world that does not carry Magic products. And so it's very difficult for some new game to come into the market and hope to ever build that kind of network. It takes a long time and a lot of effort and really a great product. You can also imagine that when a new player comes into the ecosystem, he looks around and he says, I'm not really sure if I'm going to like this whole TCG hobby. What should I buy in order to maximize my potential enjoyment with the money that I'm willing to spend? And of course, Magic is the answer, because there will always be someone at the local game store ready to play a game of Magic with them. You're likely to have Friday night Magic at the local game store, and on and on and on. And so the size of the network feeds back and forth with the value of it. Another example is economies of scale for manufacturing, for distribution, for retail. As a game grows larger and the demand for the cards increases, the print runs can be higher, which lowers the cost of the print runs. The distribution gets more economical because you may send multiple pallets by freight at a time to distributor. If card stores are dealing more of the product, it's more likely that at least a few card stores can take product by pallet freight rather than boxes through UPS or FedEx. And so all of these economies of scale roll up to make for a cheaper product in the player's pocket as the game grows. And these are things that we've seen with Flesh and Blood. Flesh and Blood has grown a lot. It originally released in the later part of 2019. It's nearly 3 years old now. There are 6 sets released. The first compilation set has been released. We're about to release Uprising, the 7th expansion. There's a strong stable of pre-constructed decks, which are an absolute necessity for any card game. You must have competently built pre-constructed decks. Everything is in place. The community is there. The secondary market is there. It's active. It's strong. And Flesh and Blood is not going anywhere. It's not a speculative startup. And I know this will upset even more people, but neither is MetaZoo. MetaZoo is not a speculative startup anymore. The kind of early life challenges that games face when they are not carried by a lot of stores, when the rare person who plays the game cannot find someone at their LGS to play with them, when there's no secondary market for singles, when the cards don't have any value because there's no secondary market. All of those challenges, Flesh and Blood and probably MetaZoo have moved past. And so there's no point in discussing that anymore. Now, games like Flesh and Blood and MetaZoo, they're in those continuous type of challenges that every game faces, that even Magic and Pokemon face, which is you have to keep designing fun new game mechanics. You have to keep coming up with interesting artwork and stories and characters and things like that for the players who care about that stuff. You have to keep releasing good product again and again. You have to keep coming to market often enough to satisfy your customers' desires for something new, but not so often that you burn them out. So Flesh and Blood and MetaZoo are really facing the same kinds of battles now that Magic, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Weiss, Digimon, all the rest are facing. They are so far past the early game speculative startup type of challenges. But there are a lot of people who still think that, well, maybe Flesh and Blood, maybe every retailer will stop carrying Flesh and Blood this month. Maybe this is the month it'll happen. And it's not going to happen. The game is well established. It's not going away. The question, like I say, is long term, is Flesh and Blood a 3% market share game? Is it a 5% market share game? Is it maybe an 8% market share game? Or maybe one day, 10, 15 years from now, it displaces Magic as the #1 game. Highly unlikely, but it could. So those are really the questions to contemplate. And I know people will sometimes frame this suggestion that Flesh and Blood could still fail in terms of risk. They'll say that, well, it's very risky to take positions in Flesh and Blood products. And I just don't believe that. I think Flesh and Blood has moved to the point where even if by absolute stroke of lightning Flesh and Blood did fail, the products will still have value. There are so many people playing. Let's say that LSS, it came out that like LSS had employees embezzling money or something, and it went bankrupt, and nobody wanted to buy the intellectual property for some crazy reason. And so the game just ceased development. There's still all this product out there that people enjoy and want to play with. It would have still been a good game in its time, and people would still desire to have a part of that into the future. More so than they desire things like old boxes of whatever the MechWarrior game was from the late 90s, or the Alien Predator card game, or that ridiculously overprinted Star Wars card game from the late 90s, or even things like Legend of the Five Rings. A game that was much better received and a lot more popular in its time. So I don't think it's speculative at all to invest in Flesh and Blood products. I don't think the game's going anywhere. And I think that the sooner that you accept that, if you're one of the people who still believes it could just have an early life failure still at this point, accept that it won't happen. Get beyond that. Invest in it if it's the type of risk that you want to take, and be happy about it. It's a great game. We want more competition in this market. We want more really good games. Because if nothing else, it forces games like Magic to keep innovating on gameplay to stay fun. So let me know what you think. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join me on Final Trade. Thanks a lot.